Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're the place that takes, well, mountains of research, foundational texts, and sort of boils them down into immediate, usable knowledge for you. Today, we are opening a door, one that was really never meant for the public. It's a doorway straight into the mind of Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king himself, through his incredibly influential but also profoundly personal journal, The Meditations.
It really is the ultimate access point, isn't it? I mean, when you stop and think that Marcus Aurelius Antoninus held, well, basically the highest temporal power on earth, ruling an empire stretching from Britain all the way to the deserts of Syria. Yet his main focus, the thing he seemed to wrestle with daily, was conquering his own thoughts. That's when the meditation stops feeling like some old textbook and becomes almost like a survival guide.
Right. And that's exactly the framing we need here. The sources we're digging into today, they go way beyond just a simple history lesson. We've got deep dives into his, noble family background, the absolutely crushing realities of his time as emperor play, constant war, even betrayal, and the underlying philosophical structure, the stoicism that basically held him together. So our mission, what we want you to get out of this, is to really extract the practical mechanism of stoicism he was using day in, day out. Because if the arguably deepest mind in the entire Roman Empire used these tools to keep his sanity while everything was falling apart, well, you need to know what those tools are.
Exactly. We're pulling together biographical context, the history of the empire at that time, and these incredibly intimate personal reflections. We want you to understand not just what Marcus wrote, but really why he felt he had to write it. It's a document of almost constant self-reprimand, self-discipline. It's essentially his personal blueprint for navigating a world that was constantly trying to pull him off course. So let's start by grounding ourselves in the man himself before he even wore the crown.
Okay, let's start with the beginning. M. Annius Verus, born 121 AD. And his origins were, well, impeccable, really. He could trace his lineage back to Numa Pompilius, the second king of Rome, who was always revered as, the most religious of early kings. So this idea of inherited duty, of a certain pious seriousness, it was literally baked into his family history.
And it wasn't just some abstract family tree thing either. His actual character, it shone through even when he was just a boy. The emperor at the time, Hadrian, was apparently so impressed by the young Marcus's sort of inherent goodness, his honesty, that he didn't just call him Verus, which is his name, he nicknamed him Verissimus, which means essentially more truthful. That's quite a nickname from an emperor, right? It speaks volumes about his moral fiber long before he was anywhere near public life.
Wow. And he was clearly being groomed for power from an incredibly early age. I mean, equestrian rank at 6, that sounds almost ceremonial, but it put him right smack in the elite class. And then by 8, he's made a member of the ancient Salian priesthood. That links him directly to Rome's oldest religious traditions. But the real turning point, the moment his destiny was basically sealed, that was the big adoption, wasn't it?
Yes, absolutely crucial. When Hadrian was sorting out the imperial succession, Marcus was adopted by Antoninus Pius, and that changed his name to Marcus Aurelius Antoninus. This adoption put him directly in line for the throne. So flash forward to 61 AD, he assumes the imperial state, becomes emperor, and like you said earlier, the world just immediately caught fire around him.
It really did. It wasn't some smooth, peaceful transition. It was just a deluge of problems. He instantly faced major wars on multiple fronts. We often talk about the burden of the throne, but Marcus seems to have faced truly existential crises right from the very beginning.
That's key. The very first major military headache was the Parthian War, way out in the east. But this is where Marcus made a decision, an innovation really, that kind of backfired later. He associated Alcyoneus Commodus, who we know better as Lucius Aurelius Verus, as his co-emperor. He wanted to share the load, So Verus gets sent off east to deal with the Parthians. But what actually happened?
Yeah, it basically turned into the fiasco of Lucius Verus, didn't it?
Right.
Verus pretty quickly just degenerated into total debauchery, drunkenness. He essentially abandoned his command, spent his time indulging in luxury while his officers did the actual fighting. And Marcus, his co-emperor back dealing with everything else, was left handling the administrative fallout, the military campaigns themselves. It is a mess.
A complete mess. And while the east was causing problems, the northern frontiers along the Danube, they presented an even bigger, more sustained threat. Marcus ended up spending a huge chunk of his reign personally involved in these campaigns against this really formidable coalition of aggressive tribes. You had the Marcomanni, the Quadi, the Sarmatians, the Chatti, the Jazyges. This wasn't a quick border skirmish. This was a long, drawn-out struggle for survival. It forced the emperor to live not in Rome, but basically in military camps for years.
And those troubles, they didn't just stay neatly contained out on the frontier, did they? They spilled right back into Rome itself. Pestilence, the Antonine Plague, probably brought back by Varus's legions returning from the east, absolutely ravaged the population. And at the same time, the Tiber River flooded, wiped out grain stores, caused widespread starvation. This wasn't just a political issue. This was a full-blown economic and humanitarian collapse.
The stress must have been unbelievable. It got so intense that Marcus had to take these really unprecedented financial steps. He actually sold off the imperial jewels, silks, gold plate, even his wife Faustina's luxurious imperial robes in public auctions. Why? To raise money for the starving people and for the war effort. Just think about the gravity of that act for a moment. The emperor is literally liquidating the equivalent of the crown jewel just to keep the government from going bankrupt. It really underscores a level of existential crisis that, frankly, very few Roman emperors ever had to face.
Wow. And yet, out of all that endless military grind, we get this legendary moment, the story of the Thundering Legion.
Mhm.
This happened during the campaign against the Quadi, you said, around 174 AD. The Roman army was apparently trapped, completely dehydrated, about to be totally overwhelmed.
Yes, the sources describe it vividly. The situation was absolutely desperate. Then suddenly, out of nowhere, this severe storm hits thunder, torrential rain. The rain refreshed the Romans, let them quench their thirst, while the story goes that lightning bolt actually struck the enemy, scattering them, turning the whole tide of the battle. So Marcus's victory was seen as, divine intervention. It really solidified his image as this divinely favored leader, even when he was right in the middle of his deepest military struggles.
But however successful he might have been as a commander, his personal life, his domestic life, seems filled with just profound sorrow and disappointment. He was apparently passionately fond of his many children, but most of them died young. And the one son who survived to adulthood, Commodus, well, he turned out to be the ultimate failure, didn't he? A ferocious and bloodthirsty tyrant who would basically undo Marcus's entire legacy almost the moment he died.
It's the ultimate, almost cruelest irony, isn't it? For a man who dedicated his entire life to virtue and duty, how does that core Stoic principle of accepting fate, accepting what you can't control, handle the monumental public failure of your own son and heir? This is the kind of immense weight Marcus was carrying, even while his writings are preaching this, almost serene indifference to external events.
And then there was the whole ongoing issue with his wife, Faustina. Scandal just seemed to follow her around. There were constant accusations of unfaithfulness, and even worse, that she had somehow encouraged Avidius Cassius, the general who rebelled against Marcus after hearing a false report that the emperor had died.
Yeah, and it's really crucial here that our sources, the ones closest to the time, they defend Marcus's judgment. They emphasize that these charges against Faustina lack any real, sure evidence. The record suggests Marcus loved her dearly and never showed the slightest hint of suspicion. He didn't engage with the gossip at all. He consistently upheld her honor, even celebrated a triumph with her just before she died, really affirming their bond. That kind of loyalty, especially set against that backdrop of constant betrayal and warfare, it highlights the immense personal effort Marcus must have put into maintaining his inner world, his own sense of stability.
So we end up with this really vivid picture, don't we? A man who ruled for nearly 20 years, facing simultaneous threats: foreign invasion, domestic plague, financial ruin, personal betrayal, all while raising a family that, in the end, profoundly failed him.
It creates this perfect historical tension, I think. The external life was just defined by constant crisis management. And then the Meditations, his private journal, documents this relentless daily effort to forge an interior fortress, a mindset that could actually withstand all of it. The contrast between, say, the harsh necessity of selling off state treasures just to survive and the incredibly calm, serene tone of self-control in his writing. That's what makes this text so incredibly powerful and relevant even today.
And that inner peace, that fortress you mentioned, it really had to be deliberately constructed, didn't it? Because as we know, the traditional Roman state religion just didn't offer much comfort for a really thoughtful person. It was very transactional, wasn't it? Almost a bargain.
Yeah.
You perform the correct rites, you get the god's favor. There wasn't much deep morality or, spiritual satisfaction to be found there.
Absolutely. Those shortcomings in Roman theology really pushed thoughtful minds towards philosophy. By Marcus's time, philosophy had, for many educated Romans, effectively replaced religion as the main source of ethics and personal satisfaction. And the two dominant schools vying for attention were Stoicism, which emphasized this kind of stubborn endurance and virtue, and Epicureanism, which focused more on achieving ataraxia, or a state of freedom from disturbance and pain.
And Marcus, he clearly found his home in the sternest, most disciplined of the two, Stoicism. Founded way back by Zeno, it was later systematized by Chrysippus, a thinker so influential they actually had a saying, but for Chrysippus, there had been no porch, the porch being the nickname for the Stoic school.
Right. And the central goal of Stoicism, the thing Marcus adopted wholeheartedly, was this idea of living in conformity with nature. The Greek phrase is homologumentis zen. But crucially, to achieve that conformity, you needed a kind of intellectual toolkit, a guidebook. And the Stoics formalized this into a threefold division of philosophy: physics, logic, and ethics.
Okay, let's unpack that a bit, because this really is the architecture of Marcus's whole way of thinking. So physics is about understanding the universe itself. What did the Stoics actually believe about the material world?
Well, Stoic physics was fundamentally materialistic, but also pantheistic. They held that only material objects truly existed, no separate spiritual realm. But and this is key running through everything, permeating all matter, was an immanent divine reason, a rational active principle. They often referred to it as God or providence or fate. It wasn't separate from the world, it was the rational order of the world. So understanding the laws of this divine rational nature, that's physics, was the absolute prerequisite for learning how to live rationally yourself, which is ethics.
Okay, so once you understand the universe is rational, you need a rational mind to perceive it correctly. That's where logic comes in, right? Kind of like the training wheels for good judgment. How did they figure out what was true?
They had a very almost physical approach to logic and epistemology. They believed the mind starts as a blank sheet, a tabula rasa. Sensations from the world then write impressions onto this sheet. These impressions over time form general concepts, which they called prolepses or anticipations. The real benchmark for truth, they called the criterion, was an impression so clear, so vivid, so compelling that your mind couldn't help but assent to it. They called this kind of impression a cataleptico-phantasia, sometimes translated as one that holds fast, or an apprehensive impression. This whole process was crucial because if you could recognize that your opinion about something was just a weak, non-compelling impression, not one of these holding fast ones, you could choose to withhold assent. You could dismiss it.
And that links directly to the third part, the most practical element, ethics. This is really where Marcus lived and breathed day to day, isn't it? The practical application of all that rational understanding.
Precisely. For the Stoics, the ultimate goal was virtue, because virtue is happiness. And conversely, vice is unhappiness. Simple as that. And this led directly to the pivotal, maybe most famous, concept of the indifferent things adiaphora in Greek. What this means is that external circumstances, your health, your wealth, physical pain, public honor, even the catastrophic failure of your son Commodus, all of these were declared morally neutral, indifferent. They couldn't, in themselves, make you truly happy or unhappy. They were merely the sphere in which virtue may act. They're the raw material, the stage, but they aren't the play itself.
Right, and this concept of adiaphora, it feels like the core tool Marcus must have used constantly to just survive the relentless crises of his reign. He had to draw the sharp distinction probably every single day, what is actually in my power and what is simply not.
Yes, that distinction is everything in practical Stoicism. The things truly in your power are entirely internal. Your judgments, your opinions, doxa, your desires, your aversions, your guiding principle, hegemonicon, that's it. Everything else, your body's health, your reputation, the loyalty of your generals, the success of the harvest, whether your wife is faithful, all of that is external and therefore, strictly speaking, indifferent to your moral worth and your potential for happiness. The constant Stoic task, the work Marcus was doing in the Meditations, is to relentlessly align your internal reactions, your opinions about these externals with the rational flow of fate and nature. Now, putting aside the philosophical system for a second, what is the book Meditations itself?
Yeah.
Because it often gets mistaken for like a formal treatise on Stoicism. It's definitely not a treatise, not at all. It's an intensely private journal. It's him recording the innermost thoughts of his heart, as one scholar put it, set down to ease it. It was absolutely never intended for publication. You're basically listening in on an emperor wrestling with his own conscience, judging his own actions and thoughts against the incredibly high standards set by his philosophy and his mentors.
And that private, candid nature, it seems to soften the philosophy itself somehow, doesn't it? Because earlier Stoicism could come across as quite grim, very focused on stern repression of emotion.
Marcus's tone is different. That grim resignation you sometimes feel in earlier Stoic writers. In Marcus's hands, it transforms into something closer to almost a mood of aspiration.
Yeah.
You feel the struggle, yes, but you also feel him constantly striving upward, trying to be better. And that struggle, that striving, makes the text far more accessible, more relatable than perhaps the colder, more systematic writings of Zeno or even his beloved Epictetus.
People often draw a comparison between the Meditations and a much later Christian devotional work, The Imitation of Christ. They point to similar ideals: self-control, examining your faults, dismissing worldly things. But the sources we looked at highlight a really profound difference in where the ultimate authority comes from.
That difference is absolutely core, and it highlights what you might call the fundamental loneliness of the Stoic path. The Roman, Marcus, appeals ultimately only to his own soul, his own reason, his sense of duty, and the inherent rationality he perceives in nature or the cosmos. The Christian author of The Imitation, conversely, appeals constantly to God's judgment, the promise of heaven, the threat of hell, and this sense of passive reliance on divine grace. Marcus's path demands this relentless, often solitary internal work of self-correction. So the great charm of the Meditations, why it still resonates, lies in its sheer intimacy, its frankness. It's not a sermon, it's a window straight into a lofty, serene soul who is constantly striving for self-rectification, not posing for anyone.
Okay, so let's talk about Book Eye of the Meditations, because it's really unique within the work. It's structured completely differently. It's essentially like a moral resume, isn't it? A list of gratitude, dedicating thanks to the specific people who supplied the moral building blocks that shaped his character. It's like his personal moral curriculum laid out right there for us.
It's a truly remarkable piece of self-reflection, yeah. Instead of thanking these people for, helping him get wealth or rank or power, he thanks them for imparting specific virtues. Starting right with his family, he thanks his grandfather, Annius Verus, the one he was originally named after, for teaching him, quote, to be gentle and meek and to refrain from all anger and passion. Now that lesson, controlling anger, that was clearly one Marcus felt he needed to revisit constantly, especially given the pressures he faced as emperor.
Then there's this unnamed figure, he just calls him that brought me up. Possibly a tutor or guardian who instilled these really practical lessons against getting swept up in, like, corrupting public enthusiasms. He specifically thanks this person for teaching him to avoid excessive partisanship in the Roman circus. The different chariot racing factions like the Reds, Blues, Whites, Greens, and also partiality for particular gladiators in the amphitheater.
These might sound like kind of trivial details now, but think about it for a future emperor. They're crucial lessons. It taught him very early on to be skeptical of mob mentality, of mass opinion, and to hold himself somewhat aloof from the corrupting passions of the crowd. The thinking is, if you can't be easily swayed by which chariot team wins, you're probably less likely to be swayed by dangerous political factions later on.
Makes sense. And the highest praise naturally seems to go to his adoptive father, Antoninus Pius, who really set the template for Marcus's entire approach to ruling. What were the defining virtues that Pius passed down, according to Marcus?
Pius comes across as the absolute model of quiet, effective competence. Marcus details his meekness, his constancy, his sort of moderate way of dealing with people, for example, not requiring his friends to constantly wait upon him, showing respect for their time and dignity. And perhaps most importantly, he thanks Pius for his accurate examination of things in consultations and patient hearing of others, plus his rigorous effort to repress flattery and actively honor true philosophers.
That detail about actively repressing flattery, that sounds so important, especially in an imperial court environment, which must have been thick with it. It suggests Pius deliberately tried to create an atmosphere where truth could actually be spoken, which has to be a rare achievement for any ruler.
Oh, absolutely.
Right.
It's arguably the ultimate administrative virtue, isn't it? Ensuring that you actually get unvarnished truth, even when it's uncomfortable or critical. Pius seems to have governed with this quiet dignity, showing Marcus by example that a truly powerful person doesn't need to resort to excessive pomp or fear dissenting opinions.
Okay, moving on to his more professional mentors, the philosophers and teachers. Let's start with Rusticus Q. Junius Rusticus. He seems to have been the one who really shook Marcus out of any lingering complacency.
Rusticus was probably his primary Stoic guide, and yeah, he was apparently quite blunt. Marcus explicitly credits him with showing him that his life wanted some redress and cure. This wasn't just abstract philosophical advice. It sounds like a direct personal intervention. Rusticus also taught him to avoid the vanity and the showmanship of the sophists, those public intellectuals who often seemed more interested in impressing crowds than finding truth.
And the most profound debt Marcus owed to Rusticus, arguably, it was a gift, right? Rusticus gave him a copy of Epictetus, his Hypomnemata, the moral commentaries, the discourses of the great Stoic teacher Epictetus.
Just pause and think about that connection for a second. The emperor of the entire known world, the most powerful man alive, receives his core ethical guidebook from the lecture notes of a man who was born a slave, Epictetus. It's the ultimate statement on the complete indifference of social rank when it comes to wisdom. And that text, those Hypomnemata transcribed by Arrian, clearly became the foundational document for Marcus's own daily practice of self-examination.
Incredible. Next up is Apollonius, who seems to have provided the living, breathing example of Stoic endurance.
Right. Apollonius, Marcus says, showed him what true liberty looked like, and this unvariable steadfastness, that quality of remaining essentially the same person regardless of external shocks or circumstances. Marcus specifically notes that Apollonius was the same man whether in the sharpest pains or after the loss of a child or in long diseases. This was Apollonius literally modeling the practical application of adiaphora. External pains, losses, illnesses, they are irrelevant to the quality of your inner self, your soul.
And then there was Sextus of Chaeronea, who was actually Plutarch's nephew, and he exemplified mildness.
Sextus seems to have demonstrated how to blend serious philosophy with everyday life and kindness. He apparently governed his own large family with real paternal affection, and he showed Marcus that achieving true philosophical discipline, the Stoic ideal of apatheia, which means freedom from disturbing passions, not apathy in our sense, did not require being cold or unfeeling. Marcus describes Sextus as achieving this apatheia while simultaneously being most tender-hearted. He seems to have been the intellectual model for how to be intensely learned yet completely humble, and how to connect these sometimes abstract philosophical principles seamlessly to practical daily living.
Lastly, Claudius Maximus. He seems to have taught Marcus more about self-control and composure, perhaps particularly in administrative or public roles.
Maximus taught him, in Marcus's words, to have power of myself and in nothing to be carried about, which means resisting those external pressures, those impulses, not being blown off course by events or other people's opinions. He also taught constancy and courage when facing sudden chances like unexpected illnesses. Marcus observed that Maximus was never hasty, but also never slow or indecisive. He possessed this sort of calm gravity that inspired confidence because, as Marcus notes, everyone knew he spoke exactly what he thought, without pretense. So, taken together, these men, his family, his adoptive father, these philosophers, they collectively provided the intellectual rigor, the emotional stability, and the practical administrative model that Marcus would desperately need to rely on when the empire seemed to be crumbling around him.
Okay, so once Marcus moves past that unique first book, the rest of the Meditations, books 2 through 12, they become this sort of flowing stream of maxims, self-reminders, philosophical notes to self. Let's try to trace the path of duty he was constantly outlining for himself, starting with Book 2, which has this relentless focus on mortality, doesn't it?
It really does. Book 2 is often seen as maybe the most powerful expression of that core Stoic sense of urgency. It kicks off with that famous mandate: perform every action as thy last action, free from all vanity and from all hypocrisy. It's such a radical call for absolute sincerity in the present moment, precisely because death is seen as imminent and fundamentally unpredictable.
Yeah, and he just strips away the illusion of having vast amounts of time, doesn't he? Reminding himself and us as readers that whether you live 3,000 years or, 10,000 years, you only ever part with the little part of life, which he now lives. The longest life and the shortest life basically come to the same thing because the only thing anyone ever truly possesses is the present moment. Losing 3 millennia just means losing an infinite number of present moments you were never guaranteed anyway.
And we have that crucial piece of context for this book, for this urgency. Book 2 is explicitly dated. He writes it whilst I was at Carnuntum. Carnuntum wasn't some peaceful retreat. It was a major Roman military fortress right on the Danube frontier, smack in the middle of the Marcomannic Wars. So he wasn't writing these reflections in the comfort of a Roman villa with a nice library. He was likely writing them in the dust and cold of a military camp, surrounded constantly by disease, hardship, and the very real threat of death. The philosophy wasn't theoretical. It was being tested every single hour.
Wow, that context changes everything. Moving on to Book 3, he seems to shift focus a bit towards appreciation and rationality, specifically this exercise of finding beauty even in natural imperfection. That always struck me as such a fascinating mental exercise.
It's a core Stoic mechanism for accepting the world exactly as it is, isn't it? He instructs himself, and by extension, us to actively look for the beauty in what we might normally see as accidents or flaws. He uses examples like the way a loaf of bread cracks when it bakes, the way figs look when they're overripe and shrinking, even the brow of a lion, its natural, maybe fierce look, or ripe olives that are, quote, next to putrefaction. The decay, the flaw, the accident in the Stoic view, these are all just part of nature's rational unfolding process, and therefore they must be accepted, even seen as comely or fitting.
And this acceptance, this seeing the rationality in everything, it leads directly to his definition of human purpose, right? The highest good for a rational creature is simply following reason, acting rationally, which means doing nothing rashly, being kindly affected towards other people, and willingly to submit unto the gods or to fate, to that rational order of the universe. It ties right back to that idea of living in conformity with nature, homologumenism.
Exactly. The rational creature must act rationally. And for Marcus, that primarily means accepting external reality as it unfolds, because it's governed by that divine reason, and dedicating oneself absolutely to duty and the common good. And that theme becomes really dominant in books 5 and 6.
He's constantly reminding himself that the very purpose of a human being is to be busy and in action, not, as he puts it, seeking soft beds. Here's the most powerful man in the world, and his focus is just on constant, tireless work for others.
And crucially, the motivation for that work has to be intrinsic, not for external reward or recognition. That's why he uses that beautiful analogy of the vine. He says a person doing a good deed should be like a grapevine, which beareth her grapes, and when once she hath borne her own proper fruit, is contented and seeks for no further recompense. The act of producing the fruit, the good work itself, is the reward. All the external rewards of the empire, the statues, the flattery, the triumphal parades, those are ultimately just distractions. They're like the purple robe he famously dismisses later, just sheep's hair is dyed with shellfish blood, fundamentally worthless.
That concept of intrinsic reward, it ties directly into his maxims about social duty, particularly that really famous line from Book 6, "That which is not good for the beehive cannot be good for the bee."
The emphasis is always, always on the whole, the collective. The individual human exists in this view primarily to contribute to the rational social structure, the beehive of human society. Therefore, any personal ambition or private gain that actually harms the whole community is inherently irrational, unnatural, and ultimately self-defeating. He uses this kind of rigorous, almost ruthless contemplation to dismiss the things the world typically prizes. He uses that stark, sometimes shocking language to uncover the vileness, as he calls it, of admired things.
Right, that famous example of the imperial purple robe being just sheep's hairs dyed with the blood of a shellfish, or even sexual intercourse being reduced to the attrition of an ordinary base entrail. Why such extreme, almost vulgar descriptions? What's the point?
It's the practical application of Stoic logic, working against perception and social convention. The world sees a purple robe and instantly assigns it immense value, status, prestige. That's the opinion, doxa, attached to it. Marcus is forcing himself to strip away that added layer of opinion by describing only the neutral, underlying physical facts. It's like a mental detox exercise. He's compelling himself to see the object itself, the raw material, not the socially constructed prestige that's been layered on top of it.
Now, moving into Book 7 and 8, we find what's maybe the hardest piece of advice for any leader, or really any human being, how to deal with other people's mistakes, their sins, their wrongdoing.
His advice here is consistently rooted in pity and understanding, not anger or retribution. If someone offends you, he argues, it is against himself that he doth offend. Why should it trouble thee? The reasoning is that the offender is acting irrationally. They are harming their own rational principle, their own soul, which is the only place true harm can occur in Stoic terms. Therefore, the person doing wrong actually needs pity and correction, not your anger or revenge.
And Book 6 gives us that ultimate, concise advice for handling opposition or injury. The best kind of revenge is not to become like unto them. Just refuse to sink to their level.
This internal mandate for forgiveness, for self-control, for performing good works without seeking any external recompense. It leads us directly to the great troubling historical paradox that we absolutely have to address when talking about Marcus, which comes up in Book 11, where Marcus refers explicitly to the early Christians.
Yes, he mentions them, but describes them as being violently and passionately set upon opposition when facing death, essentially calling it theatrical obstinacy. He clearly knew of them, but his understanding seems based entirely on slander and calumny, on misinformation. This really is the great ethical and historical blot on his otherwise admirable reign, isn't it?
It truly is, and it starkly highlights the limits of even the most sophisticated personal philosophy when it confronts deep ignorance or prejudice about another. Despite the fact that his own moral tenets, Meekness, self-control, duty, rationality, indifference to worldly goods aligned so closely with much of early Christian ethics. Marcus, as emperor, oversaw significant periods of persecution, resulting in the martyrdoms of figures like Justin Martyr in Rome and Polycarp in Smyrna. He seems to have fundamentally misunderstood their motivations, viewing their refusal to perform the token sacrifices to the imperial cult, not as a matter of profound spiritual conviction, but merely as stubborn, irrational opposition to legitimate state authority. It makes him, ironically, perhaps the most Christian of emperors in his personal philosophy, yet tragically, a persecutor of Christians in actual practice, a deeply uncomfortable truth.
But despite the incredible depth of his philosophical life, Marcus Aurelius was, first and foremost, a Roman emperor, a pragmatic administrator, and the sources suggest he was quite conscientious about it, generally treading the path already beaten by his predecessors like Hadrian and Antoninus Pius. He focused on doing his duty, keeping corruption out, wisely avoiding any grand attempt to, remodel the world on any preconceived plan. He seems to have been a stabilizer, not a revolutionary figure in governance.
Yes, and his great strength as an administrator seems to have been his judicial fairness. The administration of justice is often called the strong point of his reign. He showed particular dedication to protecting the weak and the marginalized. He actively sought out laws to protect vulnerable groups, worked explicitly to make the lives of slaves less hard, and even instituted charitable foundations using state funds to act effectively as a father figure to orphaned children. These judicial and social reforms were really a concrete manifestation of his deeply held Stoic beliefs about social unity, duty, and the common good.
Yet even the best, most conscientious ruler makes mistakes. And our sources do point to a couple of significant errors in judgment that arguably had negative consequences for the empire's future.
Right. The first one we already touched on. That dangerous innovation of creating a co-emperor in Lucius Verus. While perhaps well-intentioned, wanting to share the burden, it led directly to the chaos and moral collapse during the Parthian campaign and probably contributed to the spread of the plague. The second was apparently his tendency towards too much centralizing in the civil administration. Again, probably well-intentioned, he likely wanted to maintain control and keep corruption out, but it seems to have made the already massive imperial bureaucracy even slower, less efficient, potentially paving the way for greater administrative challenges down the road.
Now, to really understand the man behind the Meditations and the Imperial Purple, we have to look at his correspondence with his old rhetoric tutor, M. Cornelius Fronto. These letters survived, and they're incredibly revealing, aren't they? Fronto was a celebrated orator of the time, though his style is often considered a bit, vapid or overly ornate now. Yet the young Marcus, in his letters, just fairly bubbles over with enthusiasm for his master's eloquence.
It really shows Marcus's immense personal capacity for loyalty and deep affection, doesn't it? Even if, philosophically, he clearly outgrew Fronto's somewhat superficial literary preferences later on. And Fronto, for his part, did offer some practical advice. He apparently suggested Marcus maintain simplicity in his public speeches and avoid unnecessary rhetorical flourishes advice. Marcus clearly took to heart, judging by the generally straightforward, unadorned style of the Meditations themselves.
And the correspondence gives us these amazing, intimate glimpses into his daily life, especially his younger life before becoming emperor. For example, there's a letter where he describes his typical schedule during the vintage season, the grape harvest, which his adoptive father Antoninus Pius always spent out in the country. This isn't the emperor of Rome speaking. This is Marcus, the devoted student and son.
Yeah, it's wonderful. He describes studying incredibly late, sometimes from the 9th hour of the night right through until the 2nd hour of the day. He writes about waking up and immediately going to wait upon Antoninus Pius, standing respectfully by his side as his father performed the morning sacrifices, and then having this really sparse, humble lunch, literally just bread, while he notes others around them were feasting on boiled beans, onions, and fish.
Then in the afternoon, he describes them going out together into the fields to help with the grape harvest, with plenty of sweat and shouting, listening to the local farm workers joking and jibing, just enjoying the simple, earthy atmosphere of the harvest. He wrote to Fronto later that day, saying how much he missed him, even more than Rome itself. It paints this picture of intense intellectual dedication balanced by a really simple, almost rustic sense of duty to his father and connection to the land.
And we even get this fantastic glimpse of his youthful, very human side, a bit of mischief. He recounts one time, riding ahead of his father, he deliberately spurred his horse straight towards a flock of sheep, scattering them hither and thither. Apparently, it caused the poor shepherds to throw a pitchfork in consternation. It just shows this playful, maybe slightly mischievous side to the young man who would later become this incredibly sober philosopher king. It's a human moment, far removed from the stern self-admonishments we read in the Meditations.
That human warmth, though, it contrasts so sharply with the tone of the correspondence later in their lives, doesn't it? Fronto's letters, written after he suffered the immense grief of losing his own children and then his grandson, are just filled with raw pathos.
Fronto's grief is genuinely heartbreaking to read. He
Mhm.
recounts his own upright life, how faithful he'd been, how he'd avoided greed, almost protesting against the cruelty of fortune, essentially asking the universe why. Why should a good man be tormented so mercilessly? And this deeply emotional, almost despairing response to loss is the precise kind of emotionality that Marcus, through his rigorous Stoic lens, was constantly training himself to analyze, to manage, and ultimately to try and repress in himself.
And we see the ultimate synthesis of this long relationship when we look back at the Meditations. Marcus only mentions Fronto once by name in the entire journal, right near the end. And what's the lesson he draws? He thanks Fronto for teaching him to recognize how much envy, duplicity, and hypocrisy can exist among the Roman aristocracy, and how those considered patricians often lack natural affection. So he clearly valued the genuine heart and mentorship of his old teacher, but he distilled the experience down to a Stoic lesson about detachment and managing expectations about human nature. He took the positive example of affection Fronto showed him, while simultaneously maintaining that philosophical guard against potential disappointment.
Which just brings us right back to the sheer, relentless rigor of his self-discipline, doesn't it? It seems he used every single person and every single external event in his life, whether it was the plague, the wars, the failure of his own son, or even the profound grief of his beloved mentor, as fuel for his philosophical fire, as material for self-improvement and understanding. Hashtag outro.
So, to try and summarize this deep dive, then, we've really charted the extraordinary life of Marcus Aurelius. From his beginnings as M. Annius Verus, born into Roman nobility, right through a reign that was just defined by ceaseless, overwhelming external pressures. We're talking the Parthian and Marcomannic Wars, near financial collapse forcing him to sell off imperial treasures, the devastating Antonine Plague, and of course the profound personal tragedy of his heir Commodus.
And we've established that the core mechanism, the operating system he used to try and navigate to survive this relentless chaos, was Stoicism, applied with incredible rigor every single day. He learned crucial virtues like constancy, justice, and self-control from his mentors, people like his adoptive father Antoninus Pius, and philosophers like Rusticus, who crucially gave him those notes from Epictetus. And he practiced these daily maxims, these self-reminders, that forced him to accept the brevity of life, to find beauty even in nature's imperfections, to dedicate himself absolutely and tirelessly to the common good, and ultimately to focus only on controlling his internal world, his opinions, his judgments, and his desires.
So, the ultimate takeaway for you, the listener, from all of this is that Marcus Aurelius provides this incredibly rare, incredibly powerful example of a person who achieved immense worldly power and success alongside profound personal virtue and inner peace. And he did it despite living through overwhelming global and personal chaos. His life and his writings teach that your mind, your judgments, your actions, your capacity to judge rationally and act virtuously, these are the only things truly in your power. Everything else, the sickness, the scandal, the betrayal, the war, ultimately, it's just external material, indifferent.
Which leaves us with the final, really challenging Stoic thought for you to take away. Marcus, writing probably from his cold tent on the Danube frontier at Carnuntum, truly believed that genuine injury could only come from within, from your own bad judgments. This meant that another person's wickedness or a disastrous external event was, in a fundamental sense, altogether indifferent to his own well-being. His core idea was, if you remove your opinion that an external event is harmful, the feeling of harm itself vanishes.
So, the question we want to leave you with is this. Look closely at your own life right now. Can you identify one significant external source of stress or unhappiness? Maybe it's a difficult colleague, a financial worry, perhaps a frustrating global event, or a personal setback. Now, can you attempt the Stoic exercise? Can you try to mentally strip away your opinion of its harmfulness? Can you reduce it just in your mind to a neutral fact, something happening outside the jurisdiction of your own inner self, your soul, and just see, does the feeling of trouble, the stress, begin to lift, even just a little? That is the kind of rigorous, practical, and potentially transformative self-discipline that Marcus Aurelius demanded of himself every single day.